Good evening, everyone. I am Advocate Anand Kumar. I am practicing in Delhi High Court. I am going to be your host and the moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of my team AP Legal Chambers and on my personal behalf, I welcome you all for this 12th webinar of the series titled The Evolution of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code 2016 by our special speaker, Mr. Kush Chaturvedi, Advocate on Record, Supreme Court of India. Firstly, we thank all the participants for your continuous support. As always, we just keep a request from our end to all the participants. Kindly mute your audios and if possible, disable the videos from your end too. The session is a completely moderated one, and once the presentation of our special speaker gets over, the APLC's APLC and the question answer segment would follow. If you have any questions to ask our special speaker, you can kindly leave it in the chat box, and if time permits, all your questions will be answered by him. With each passing webinar, we are trying our level best to improve and elevate one step further. Intense research, coordination, man management, data analytics, etc. goes before organizing and hosting these webinars. We are evolving too. We have been watching the recordings of our previous webinars again and again and do error corrections. We try to give something new in each of our webinars. We come up with new segments, renowned special speakers, and very interesting topics. We want to give our participants nothing but the best. We owe the entire credit of this event to our special speaker, Mr. Kush Chaturvedi. After all, we are just setting up a stage for the special speaker to connect with the participants and vice versa. As a formal introduction about the organizers for the event, we are Team AP Legal Chambers, a new age law firm in Delhi NCR with a branch office in Chennai. Things started falling in place in 2017 and we had committed ourselves of providing legal support and trying to give our clients one step for solving their legal issues to the best of our abilities. APLC has been providing specialized services in the areas of domestic and international taxation, constitutional laws, IPR, energy law, commercial advisory, arbitration, and corporate compliances. We started organizing these webinars out of our passion for law, and due to extremely positive response from our participants, we are organizing the webinars on every Thursdays and Sundays. As always, once the special speaker's presentation gets over, we shall be having the segment called APLC's APLC, Ask the Popular Learned Counsel. We have prepared a few questions from our end and we will be asking the special speaker. I am sure it will be interesting and informative. Webinar, we shall be covering the evolution of IBC and Bankruptcy Code, history, and in the present context. We shall get to understand the IBC as a whole after the presentation of our speaker. Let me give a formal introduction about our special speaker. Mr. Kush Chaturvedi is an advocate on record practicing in the Supreme Court of India. He graduated with a degree in LLB from the Government Law College, Mumbai, affiliated to the Mumbai University in 2006. After graduating, he worked with P.H. Parekh & Co. for a couple of years before joining the chambers of Ms. Indu Malhotra, senior advocate and currently a sitting judge in the Honorable Supreme Court of India. He cleared the Advocate on Record examination conducted by the Honorable Supreme Court in the year 2013, and since then he has been pursuing an independent practice. He has been empaneled with the IFCI Limited for all fora since 2013, and he has appeared for Maharashtra State Road Development Corporation, Ulhasnagar Municipal Corporation, Indian Overseas Bank, and various government organizations, departments in the Supreme Court. He has also appeared for various private companies, including Tata Power Limited, Sri Renuka Sugars, Times Now, Kalpataru Housing, East and West Builders, medical colleges from across the country before the Honorable Supreme Court of India. When I approached Mr. Kush for this webinar, without even taking a second, he graciously consented to be the special speaker for the day. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our special speaker. Without delaying any further, I welcome Mr. Kush to APLC's webinar. I am so excited to listen to his speech. Welcome on board and over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. And I must thank AP Legal Chambers for giving me this opportunity to interact with all of you. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, sir, it is audible. It is audible. Yeah.
So this, I believe, is the 12th webinar, and I must commend you on the effort which has been made during these hard times in order to keep everyone abreast about the latest developments in the law. So when I was approached a day before yesterday, so I thought I would, because it is of interest to lawyers, law students, you have chartered accountants, company secretaries, a different class of professionals created by the Act called Insolvency Resolution Professionals, and of course to the managerial personnel of various companies. The other thing about the IBC is that it's comparatively recent in origin. So all of us have sort of seen this statute and the case laws right from the inception. So that gives us we've grown along with this act. So it gives us a unique insight into how this act works and what it seeks to achieve. So the structure of my address today is to first give you a brief outline as to why the Parliament thought that we needed a fresh act, entirely comprehensively new code to deal with the issue of insolvency. I will then just look to give you the certain key features of the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code and what it seeks to achieve. I will then give you a brief, very broad framework of why I feel that the courts have interpreted this act in its true purport and have in fact furthered the objective of the act, and how the Parliament itself has also been proactive in coming out with amendments, ordinances, because this is a comparatively, like I said, comparatively recent legislation. So the Parliament has also been very proactive in fine-tuning the act, if I may call it so. And lastly, what I feel in the future, there are some issues which the courts have to settle with respect to the IBC, and which the government has to settle with respect to the infrastructure which is required. So like I said, first I will talk on the need for the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code. Why was this code required? Because as all of you who've been practicing courts would recognize, we've had the Companies Act since of the 1956, the previous Companies Act of 1956, which had provisions dealing with winding up and of companies, voluntary winding up of companies. It had provisions for official liquidators, and ones on which a company could be wound up if the company was unable to pay its debts. So we had right since 1956 we had the Companies Act which dealt with this. Then in 1985 we had the Sikh Industrial Companies Act, or the SICA as we called it, which firstly created a completely different tribunal called the Board for Industrial and Financial Reconstruction, with the aim of restructuring of companies. Then in 1993, the Parliament enacted the Recovery of Debts Due to Banks Act. We call it the RDDB Act of 1993, which again introduced the concept of debt recovery tribunals, the appellate tribunals, and it set up a completely different mechanism for recovery suits. So instead of filing mortgage suits or recovery suits, banks had this entirely new fora exclusively for them, where they could, institute their recovery claims. Then in 2002 came a sea change, where for the first time the Parliament enacted the Sarfazi Act, the Securitization Act. Why I call it a sea change is because for the first time, it was only in 2002 that the secured creditors, banks, etc., got a right to enforce their security interest without the intervention of courts. So it was a sea change. So without having to go to court, uh, under the Sarfazi Act, a secured creditor could simply issue a notice, and then within 60 days, if the debt was not repaid, could go ahead and auction off the secured asset and thereby recover its money. So, like I said, different fora under acts. You had the High Court, you had the debt recovery tribunals, you had the BIFR, and the appellate authority for all these. But we realized that this was not a very happy scenario for banks and lenders, because we found that even though specialized fora had been made, the the delays and the interference in courts was so much that it defeated the entire purpose. Uh, Many of you will be practicing in the DRT. Uh, it's a tribunal which is frankly not doing its job, if I may put it harshly. Uh, Various reasons for that, but the end result is that it was not a very happy scenario for secured creditors to recover their money. Substantial delays, like I said, a lot of interference by courts. So this led to a situation where in 2016, where the World Bank ranked India in a list of 190 countries as 135 on its index resolving insolvency. So India was placed 135 out of 190, despite many legislations, like I have pointed out, dealing with this. The World Bank also found that at an average in the UK, insolvency resolution took a year. In the US, it took a year and a half. In countries like South Africa, it took a couple of years. But India, at an average, it took 4.3 years to resolve an insolvency proceeding. So 4.3 years. So it was clearly not a happy scene. So which is why in 2016, the Parliament enacted what we now call the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016. The preamble states that its purpose was to consolidate and amend laws relating to reorganization and insolvency resolution of corporate personnel. The IBC also deals with insolvency of partnership firms and individuals, but those provisions are yet to be enacted, and as I will point out, are yet to be given effect to. Though those provisions are contained in the Act, those provisions have not been brought into force yet by the government. So in the later part of my speech, I will address as to how that needs to be changed. But as far as corporate entities are concerned, the IBC seeks to consolidate and amend laws relating to insolvency of corporate entities. And the five essential features of the Act are that it seeks to do so in a time-bound manner. So promptness is of paramountcy as far as this Act is concerned. The Act also seeks to maximize the value of assets of companies which are in the insolvency resolution process. And of course, the prime purpose of this Act was to increase the ease of doing business, to promote the availability of credit. Because if, let's understand this, because if banks find it difficult to recover their investment, they would be hesitant in giving loans in the first place. So this Act kept that in mind, and therefore promotion of entrepreneurship was also a key feature of this Act. and to ensure the sea chain, the key difference between the IBC and the acts which I have mentioned in the past is that it seeks to remove, to protect the management, to protect the company from its own management. The management which led the company to this sorry state, the Act seeks to protect the corporate debtor, the company, from its management. So those are the 4-5 key features which the Parliament kept in mind while enacting the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Now, what are the key features? I'll just take you very broadly through the key features, salient features of this Act. Like I said, firstly, it creates two different class of creditors, one being the financial creditors and the other being the operational creditors. Now, what are financial creditors? Financial creditors are largely banks, financial institutions which give loans to companies. Uh, so why they've been placed at a different pedestal is because uh, usually, in fact, in almost 100% of these cases, there would be a written contract, there would be um, mortgage deeds, there would be a loan agreement, they would all be a matter of record. So these are debts which will not be disputed. So, for example, if SBI gives X sum of money to Kingfisher, there would be a loan document which would incorporate the terms and conditions of the loan. There would be mortgage deeds, and there would be a repayment schedule. So, which are facts which cannot be disputed by the financial creditor. So, therefore, the Act provided for financial creditors like banks, financial institutions, which were put in a different pedestal. And the second would be the case of operational creditors, where there would be a hire purchase agreement or uh, goods which were availed. So where there was always a scope where the parliament thought of some dispute between the parties. So say for example, X company supplied goods to Y companies and Y company did not pay for them. Now it could very well be that Y company did not pay for them because the goods were substandard, or there was some delay uh, in the exchange of the goods. So therefore, operational creditors were put in a different class, and whereas in the financial creditors, for the financial creditors, there was no need to prove that it was an admitted debt because, like I said, documentation was there. Operational creditors, the operational debtor, for example, could always dispute the debt of an operational creditor, and in that case, the company would not enter IRP. So there were sufficient safeguards made. An operational creditor, for example, always had to issue a demand notice, and if in the reply the debtor took a defense that the debt is disputed, the company would not enter IRP. So the Act created these two different class of creditors. The distinction between them has been upheld by the Supreme Court as not being violative of Article 14. So that is one key feature of this Act: financial creditors and operational creditors, and distinction there. Time-bound mechanism, like I said, uh, Parliament has now said that within 330 days, including the time spent in court, the insolvency resolution process has to come to an end. What does that mean? That means from the time the insolvency process commences, it has to conclude within 330 days. If you get a resolution plan which is acceptable to the creditors, brilliant. If not, the company will go into liquidation. So the old scenario under the SICA or the 1956 Companies Act, where winding up proceedings lingered on and on, the parliament decided to do away with that. So time-bound mechanism, very important. Then the parliament introduced this concept of a moratorium. So within the 330 days, when the time given by the parliament to conclude the there would be a moratorium. No, the old proceedings continue against the corporate debtor. Proceedings with whether in any tribunal, etc., would be stayed to give a genuine chance for the resolution professional to get back from the red. The key feature of the act being that instead of the old management being in charge of the company, now the creditors were given uh, keys to their own destiny. So all the decisions would be taken by a committee of creditors. Any resolution plan would require, say, a concurrence of 66% of the committee of creditors. So the creditors were in charge. So, say, like a company, I'm giving an example of Kingfisher. Um, if the Kingfisher owes a lot of money to banks, now it would be banks who would be in charge of the future of Kingfisher as to how uh, the sale has to happen. So the creditors themselves have been empowered now to take decisions which affect their own viability. Uh, like I said, the Act has introduced a new class of professionals called insolvency resolution professionals, who are professionals who help the resolution process and manage the corporate debtor, um, during the entire process. The previous management, which is like I said, the person's responsible for bringing the company to this stage. The company has been protected from these previous management, which is a sea change. Um so, in fact, even a resolution plan by such, uh, a member is not considered by the COC. Uh, the Supreme Court has said they can't even appear on behalf of the company. So they can appear only as interested parties, as former directors. They cannot represent the company in any proceedings. The aim is to protect the corporate data from its own management. Uh, so on and so forth. So after this comes, if the committee of creditors approve a resolution plan by say Y party, where the Y party says this is how I will restructure the loans, this is how I'll get the corporate data back from the red. Uh, the committee of creditors may approve the plan. If not, after 330 days, the company has to go into liquidation. The IRP becomes the liquidator, and the Act also establishes tribunals like the adjudicating authority, which in fact is the National Company Law Tribunal. There is an appellate a tribunal. There are appeals to the Supreme Court, and certain unique things under the IBC. For example, it protects preferential transactions, undervalued transactions. So what happens here is, if the management knows that oh, I'm unable to pay my debts, and somebody might invoke IBC proceedings against me, let me get rid of the assets to protect myself. So the IBC Act provides for prevention of that. It says you can go back in time and cast suspicion on those preferential transactions, undervalued transactions. So it's a completely new code. This is not a forum to go into the nitty-gritties of the Act. I've tried to give you a very broad framework of what the key features of the Act are. I'd be welcome to take questions on specifics if you have any. Now, going on to how courts and the Supreme Court in general have dealt with this act, and challenges whichever is in, like I said, 2016 enactment. So therefore, and a completely new regime, and the Supreme Court has, I'm proud to say, has reacted very positively to the IBC. So broadly, what are the principles which the Supreme Court has laid down in interpreting the IBC? First, non-interference in legislative wisdom. The IBC pertains to economic policy, and the Supreme Court has said unless there is something palpably arbitrary, manifest arbitrary, only then the Supreme Court or the adjudicating authority or the NCLAT should interfere. So the Parliament has been given a free play in the joints, as I call it, in economic legislation. The Supreme Court has interpreted the IBC purposive interpretation as a literally they have right to give effect to the meaning of the act. Now, one small example, like I may give you, the Supreme Court has said, like I said, the key feature of the act is to give control to the committee of creditors. So the creditors decide how best they can get their money back. And the Supreme Court has said, in matters pertaining to their commercial wisdom, there can be no interference at all. It's a business decision, and courts, the NCLT, the NCLAT, and even the Supreme Court itself are not the best decision makers when it comes to commercial wisdom. So please leave it to the committee of creditors. They themselves know, they are the experts in the field and they best know how to recover their monies. So the Supreme Court, as far as resolution plans are concerned, takes a very broad view of it and just seeks to ensure uh, that the assets of the corporate debtor give maximum value, that the interest of all stakeholders, whether it be financial creditors, operational creditors, workmen, etc., everybody's interest is protected, and as far as possible, the corporate debtor continues as a going concern. So those are just the very limited scope of judicial review which the Supreme Court has thought it fit to impose on the IBC. Otherwise, like I said, uh, the Parliament is free in economic matters. In commercial decisions, it is the Committee of Creditors which decides. Uh, SR Steele's judgment by Justice Nariman is what I recommend uh, reading on this issue. Uh, then the Supreme Court has also, like I said, interpreted this act to further its objectives. So no strict interpretation, no literal interpretation of it. So in a fit case, the Supreme Court has found a registered trade union also to be an operational creditor. So it is thought out of the box as this judgment, as this act ought to be interpreted. Uh, so personal guarantors tried to come into the fold of the moratorium and said that, okay, I'm a personal guarantor, the corporate debtor is under moratorium, nobody can proceed against the corporate debtor, therefore nobody should proceed against me, the guarantor. So the Supreme Court said, nothing doing, you're a personal guarantor, you are outside the scope of the moratorium, and therefore if the creditor wants to proceed against the personal guarantor, the uh, creditor is free to do so. Like I said, they've been very careful in distinguishing between financial creditors and operational creditors. So, as far as operational creditors are concerned, the Supreme Court says that if you dispute it, no IRP, no insolvency resolution process would be commenced against you, as long as superfluous, or the old word illusory, moonshine. So the Supreme Court has said, as long as you have a triable case as an operational creditor, as an operational debtor, uh, you would be free from the clutches of the IBC. To give a case again, as far as operational creditors are concerned, in a case where an arbitration award had come and the operational debtor challenged the award, filed objections, and in the meantime the operational creditor decided to go the IBC route. So the Supreme Court said, no, this is not a recovery mechanism. The operational debtor has invoked his defense under the Arbitration Act, so you can't invoke the IBC. Then, like I had mentioned, the time periods in the IBC are of great significance. So the Supreme Court has interpreted these it's a very common sense approach the Supreme Court is taking. For example, if there is a time to clear defects, something as simple as that. If somebody has moved the NCLT and there are defects, and the IBC says you could clear defects within 7 days, the Supreme Court says those 7 days are not mandatory. So therefore, the corporate debtor can't say, oh, you haven't cleared defects in 7 days, and therefore the petition has to fail. Supreme Court says no, those 7 days are not mandatory. Similarly, 14 days were given to the NCLT to admit or to reject, uh, the application. So the Supreme Court has said even though 14 days are not mandatory, uh, so it's a very common sense approach, and that's to be applauded. In fit cases, the Supreme Court has used its powers under Article 142, for example, in JP's case, to recommence the insolvency resolution process. So on the whole, the Supreme Court has also been, uh, I would say, has been very proactive. It has uh, seen the act with the right lenses, and that bodes well for the future. The Parliament also, it's a 2016 Act. There have already been, five major amendments to the Act, even during the Corona times. The Parliament has stepped in recently with an ordinance to protect, companies from the rigors of the IBC. So the Parliament has been proactive. The Supreme Court has been proactive. So these are good tidings for the future. Just a few things in where the Parliament can, of course, tweak this. Firstly, is like I said in the beginning, the code, apart from companies, also deals with insolvencies of individuals, partnership acts, which were otherwise under the old days uh, dealt with by the Presidential Insolvency Act, the Provincial Insolvency Act. So those provisions, though they are contained in the IBC, not yet being given effect to. So the Parliament should do that, so that we have one comprehensive code which deals with insolvency of all parties. For that, the authority is the Debt Recovery Tribunal under the IBC, but the Parliament has to get the DRT and even the NCLT, NCLAT in full shape. The DRTs are woefully under equipped right now, so that needs to change. There are certain issues pertaining to the IBC which are pending in the Supreme Court. One example which comes to mind is the issue of limitation. So say for example there is a long barred debt. Some bank gave a loan in the 1990s and has sat on it since then. And suddenly in 2016 this act comes in and the bank wakes up and says, okay, this act has given me a cause of action. So that is clearly not the correct way. But if a bank, for example, has been agitating its rights under the previous enactments, certainly those matters ought to be continued under the IBC. So these matters are pending for the Supreme Court, and the sooner we have clarity on these issues, I think the better it will for all of us. So that is it as far as I am concerned, giving you a broad overview of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer those. And at the end, I'd like to thank AP Legal Chambers again for this opportunity to interact with you. So if you have any further questions, Anand, over to you.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful presentation. Like you mentioned earlier, when we had a call, you said it will be very generic, in the sense it will not be very technical. So just to tell to our participants, this has been covered in a very, very generic manner, and our special speaker has given a broader perspective of this act. I thank our special speaker for that. One announcement which I would like to make is, I welcome our participant, Ms. Rama from New Jersey. It is 9 a.m. now in New Jersey, and we are humbled and honored by the support and warmth extended by the participants. We are continuously getting participation and support from people from all parts of the world. And I thank and I also request all the participants to continue their patronage. It is because of you people we are providing the best webinars by bringing in the best speakers on board. Yeah, thank you. And now coming back to the topic, sir, it was very insightful. Now, with your permission, let us move to the next segment called APLC's APLC. It is Ask the Popular Learned Council. We have prepared a set of questions for you based on this particular topic. So, if shall we just proceed with the question answer, sir, for this particular
Absolutely.
topic? Yeah.
Absolutely.
The first question is, IBC has specialized professionals, insolvency resolution professionals, as competent people to practice and plead. Do you think is it necessary to have separate set of individuals, given that we have highly qualified and competent advocates, chartered accountants, company secretaries in our midst? What is your take, sir?
Yeah, I think it's always better, to leave the specifics to a professional. I can answer for advocates. Advocates certainly can't or shouldn't, in fact, venture into the details which, the IRP under the IBC is required to go into. Chartered accountants also have a different statutory responsibility and role to play. And as I see it, the IRP has to be a bit of, a jack of all trades, because there are a whole host of compliances, regulatory compliances, uh, avenues which he has to look into. And I think advocates can do the work, can step into the shoes of an IRP at all.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful answer. But personally, I feel since it is a boutique of various services, the professionals can themselves learn this as and when they come into practice. But I personally feel conducting the IRP exam by IBBA is somewhat adding too much of cook spoil the broth, just adding too much of this thing into the profession. I personally feel it. Moving on to the next question. Is it audible? I think there is some noise in between. Is it
No,
audible?
you're
Yeah.
audible. You're audible.
Yeah. Thank you. Moving on to the next question. Sir, SICA to RDDB to IBC. Do you see the evolution of the Act as organic, or the changing business scenario demanded the government to introduce this legislation out of compulsion? What is your take, sir?
I think if India had to be competitive in a world market, the earlier regime was clearly not suited for it. So whether you call it compulsion or I see it more as a evolutionary growth, where we learned from the mistakes. It took us a lot of time to learn, but we've learned from our mistakes, and we've tried to take care of it. It also, I would say historically, because if you go back in the 50s, 60s, where workmen as a class, their interests had to be looked into, and the profit motive was looked down upon. But now, to remain competitive in this global market, I think something like this is absolutely imperative. We would have lost out had we not had a regime change.
So I'm given to understand that it is inevitable, and of course, if not for these new legislations, we would still lag behind in already stagnant Indian process of settling these issues.
Yes, yes.
Yes, sir. So moving on to the next question, sir. Based on your presentation, I'm given to understand that 330 days is the time limit to wind up a particular case.
Yes.
Sir, it is clear from here that time is the essence. Do you think the insolvency resolution professionals or the COC takes this aspect into consideration while taking up one particular matter for settling the issue? Do you think this is kept in mind, or this is one of the important considerations that has been taken up by this considered by this IRP or COC before taking up a particular case, sir? Because personally, I have seen a lot of cases going beyond 330 days. In fact, 600, 700, 800, in fact, 1000 days. So, what is your take, sir?
Uh, See, if the committee of creditors is, uh, I would say, alert to the situation, then this 330 days it can be extended. The
Sir,
Supreme Court has in fact.
I'm sorry, sir. Actually, there is some disturbance from your end, sir. Actually, the audio is cracking.
Am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Now it is clear. Yeah, please, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like I was saying, the COC, of course, in some cases, I think seeing the complexity of those cases, if you're referring to, uh, these JP, Amrapali, etc.
Yes.
I think the complexity of those matters is such, and the element of house owners, being also very, I would say, affected by those issues. But by and large, the COC definitely does keep this 330 days in mind. The Supreme Court has, in a few cases, said this 330 days can be extended by a few days if, in fact, there is a resolution plan which is almost at the, final stage. But see, it's the losses of the committee of creditors. Don't be proactive, sit on it, and let the company go into liquidation. You'll only get lesser returns. So it's, I think it's self-defeating for the under the IBC.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very true. Uh, there are certain cases which has gone beyond this time of 330, like just you said about the Amrapali case. But in fact, most of the cases, I think they are also making earnest effort from their end to complete the case as and when it is on the verge of coming for a conclusion. Sir, we have got very, very interesting questions from the participants. Even though we have got few more questions from our end on APLC segment, but let us just switch over to the questions asked by our participants, so
Sure.
that opportunity will be given to all the participants to address their questions. Sir, with your permission, let me just shoot the first question. It is asked by Ms. Parinita Goswami. What is the effect of COVID-19 and IBC code? In fact, she has asked one more question in this. In light of distress faced by the companies due to the pandemic and lockdown, the government has amended the IBC to protect the companies from corporate debt. Can we say that the drafting done is bad in amendment?
See, this is an unprecedented situation we all are facing, and we have to keep in mind the expediency in which the government had to act. And yes, with hindsight, we can say they could have, taken care of it better. The wordings of the ordinance, but by and large, I don't think anyone is complaining. And any relief which the corporates get, I think is welcome in these days.
Sir, what is your take on this particular word which has been asked by our participant, corporate debt, to protect the companies from the corporate debt? Do you see an visible corporate debt happening in our Indian economy, considering the how bad the market is becoming? Do you see? Do you also feel there is a kind of corporate debt happening in India?
I would say not corporate death, but certainly corporate ICU. But that has nothing got to do with the act. Like I said, this is just an unprecedented, crisis which the world is in. So it's immensely difficult on everybody, including corporates. Uh,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I hope
not a
Ms.
very
Parinita. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please. Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So I think Ms. Parinita would have got the answer for her question. Moving on to the next question, it is by Mr. Nitin Sharma. If the resolution plan only provides for repayment of financial creditor and not for the operational creditor, what about the rights of the operational creditors? Because Mr. J. Mukhopadhyay NCLAT observed in one of his judgments that operational creditors are to be paid at least something. They shouldn't be left out of the resolution plan. But the Honorable Supreme Court in SR judgment overruled the observation of the NCALT. So did the Supreme Court fail to take into consideration the interest of the operational creditors, because operational creditors are small investors who are not extremely rich as financial creditors. What is your
So, in fact, what the Supreme Court has held is one of the key features. In fact, one of the few grounds on which courts can interfere with the decision of can interfere with the resolution plan is if uh, the interest of all stakeholders, including operational creditors, is not taken care of. So, if the operational creditors are their interests are not taken care of, in fact, that is one of the few grounds on which courts will interfere with the resolution plan and not leave it to the commercial wisdom. Uh, there will never be a situation where everybody will be happy. Let's be very honest with that. The Supreme Court and in fact the Parliament also found that the scale of the amount of money which is due to a financial creditor is much larger. And like I said, it is undisputed. Whereas though operational creditors are comparatively their stake is smaller, but their stake is uh, the court does take care of the interest of operational creditors to uh, a large extent, but you can understand that the portion of debt is also lesser. So, for example, in a big company, 90% of the debt would be due to the financial creditor, and only 10% of the debt would be owed to operational creditors. And there is the element of a disputed debt. Like I said, an operational creditor, you've supplied goods. Now, the operational debtor may say that those goods are substandard. So it is not an undisputed debt. So to that extent, there is a distinction between them. It may be unfair in a few cases, but by and large, the Act does take care of the interests of operational creditors.
Sir, do you think the major chunk of the amount which is outstanding is what determines the outcome of the issue, or it is just like pie to pie case? Financial creditors, as you mentioned, they have got more outstanding compared to the operational creditors. Do you think the quantum plays a big role here, or it is just that the magnitude here makes the professionals, the insolvency resolution professionals, to go that way?
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
No, no, sir. I am just asking you. Uh, does the quantum of the amount outstanding by for the financial creditors makes it important for the insolvency resolution professionals to consider uh, for the financial creditors, or it is just the magnitude of the outstanding that sways in favor of the financial creditors, sir? It is just by seeing the magnitude of amount outstanding, the IRPs decide to sway it in the favor of financial creditors rather than the operational creditors, sir.
I won't look at it this way. To put it differently, uh, if your resolution plan is subject to approval, of course, if somebody challenges it, if the courts feel that the financial creditors being in majority and by virtue of the sheer scale of their debt, if they are stepping onto the shoes of the operational creditor, the resolution plan will not succeed. It will not pass muster in courts. So therefore, it would do well for the committee of creditors, which constitute the financial creditors, to keep in mind that the interests of the operational creditors.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Now, quickly moving on to the next question. It is by Mr. Akash. He's asking, sir, in case of moratorium period, Section 138 case, whether it can be entertained?
Akash, I'll have to come back to you on that, but uh, as far as I think, it's a criminal proceeding. Therefore, I don't think a moratorium would affect a 130 proceeding, but if you would leave your email address, I'd sure to get back to you on that after checking the law on it. So you excuse me on that.
Yes, Mr. Akash, I am sure you'll be getting your answer. Our special speaker will be connecting with you once the session gets over. Now, quickly moving on to the next question. It is by Mr. Prakash Kumar. Under what circumstances can one file for bankruptcy in India? How is it done?
Under the act, if we are dealing with a company or with a corporate person, is the question related to a corporate person or to an individual?
Sir, it is asked as a general question, sir. So I think we can cover both.
So, like I said, as far as individuals are concerned, even though the Insolvency Bankruptcy Code does have provisions dealing with insolvency of individuals, but those provisions have not been given effect to yet. So, therefore, if an individual is to be declared bankrupt, it will have to be under the provisions of the Presidency Insolvency Act or the Provincial Insolvency Act, as the case may be. With respect to companies, broadly it is under the IBC. The circumstance is, like I said, if you are an operational creditor, then if there is an undisputed debt, then you can move the adjudicating authority under the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. If you're a financial creditor, then based on the fact that your loan has not been repaid, as would be evident from your banker's statement, the loan document, the mortgage document, you can invoke provisions of Section 7 of the IBC, which pertain to financial creditors.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the clarification. I hope Mr. Prakash would have got the answer. Now, quickly moving on to the next question. Sir, what in your opinion is COC's transparency and commitment towards the creditors is concerned, sir? COC on this. The committee's transparency and commitment towards the purpose for which the committee has been established. Do you think it is? I'm sorry, just adding one more question. Do you think the same thing is followed in letter and spirit, or it is just an eyewash in front of the people? I'm sorry to ask about that, but the term used, but I just want to clarify to our audience whether the thing is being followed in letter and spirit, sir, by the COC.
See, as far as transparency is concerned, the meetings, even though it's only the financial creditors who have a right to vote and they constitute the committee of creditors, but the information pertaining thereto is available even, say, to the ex-management. In one of the Supreme Court decisions, even the ex-management has a right to attend the meeting and have access, to the resolution plan, for example, and other information. The information memoranda is in the public domain. So, therefore, transparency, if you're diligent about your rights, transparency is taken care of. And as far as the COC is concerned, like I said, it's self-defeating for the COC, to not be alert to its rights and duties under the Act, because if they are not alert, they won't get the money back and they have to explain to their shareholders.
Yes, sir. You think there is a check and balance between the actual process which is being carried out by the COC and the things which are being established in the legislation?
The legislation provides for it. Now, in operation, if I don't know if you're hinting at some some sort of misfeasance, at the hands of the committee of creditors or the bankers, that's a different thing. You can't blame the Act for it. But the Act does provide broadly, and like I said, logic dictates that the COC is, alert about its role under the entire process.
Yes, sir. Sir, you were touching upon the previous management's role. Can you just throw some light on the role of the previous management, sir? Once the official liquidation starts, what is their role after the OL takes place, sir?
See, once the OL takes place, as far as the ex-management is concerned, so this is when the resolution plan has failed. Before that, like I said, during the resolution plan itself, the act specifically keeps the ex-management out. So they can't even give a resolution plan. A related party there to them is also, stopped from, participating in the resolution process. So they are completely out of the process as far as the resolution is concerned, because the parliament thought that they don't have the best interests of the company in mind. Now, once the resolution process fails and the company goes into liquidation, then it is just a question of the claims being decided and the company being liquidated. So as such, they have no role once the company goes into liquidation.
Yes, sir. That is why I asked this specific question, sir, because there is absolutely no say for the previous management, the ex-management during the resolution process. But do they have anything to say when the OL process is being initiated,
See,
or even then? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
they
Please.
have to cooperate with the OL. So, for example, if the OL requires some information regarding the company and its affairs, the books, the ex-management is duty bound to cooperate with the OL to help him, assist him in the liquidation process. So, to that extent, their duties are all there.
Sir, just for the clarification and for the participants, what is the remedy available for the COC if the previous management does not cooperate with the resolution process, sir? Is there anything that has been specified in the act?
Yes, you can move the NCLT. There have been cases where if the ex-management has been say hiding the books, or not cooperating with the IRP, you can move the NCLT, that's the adjudicating authority, for appropriate orders. Those orders have been passed in many cases. If there is a preferential of the IRP to set aside those preferential transactions. So the Act contains sufficient safeguards to bring the ex-management to book if they are not cooperating with the process.
Sir, can simultaneously criminal proceedings be filed against the management? Can it go hand in hand, sir? Once the resolution process has been started, can the financial creditors, or for that matter any other outsider, can they initiate legal proceeding, criminal proceedings against the management, and whether it can also go hand in hand, or it is not advisable?
Now, in a given case, if say the promoter of a company has siphoned off funds, of course you can file a case for cheating, for criminal breach of trust. So there is no bar to criminal proceedings as such. Under the IBC also, the IBC prescribes for offences and penalties, for offences under the Act. So in a given case, yes, if you can make out a criminal case, you can criminal proceedings are initiated daily. You have the case of promoters of all these, for example, these housing societies. They are under the IBC regime, and simultaneously criminal proceedings have been initiated against most of them.
Yes, sir. Sir, is there any special protection available for the independent directors in the company, or it is just they are also treated on par with the other directors and the management?
Yeah, so that does not, the independent directors and the protection afforded to independent directors is under the Companies Act now of 2013, where the liabilities of independent directors have been limited. The IBC as such does not differentiate, but obviously, like I can think of a case where if the IRP obtains some information which an independent director ought to possess, the independent director would also have to cooperate with the IRP. But under the Companies Act, there is protection afforded to the independent directors.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. In case of that, the Companies Act will prevail. No, sir. Yeah. Yes. Sir, moving on to the next question. Sir, can you just briefly elaborate on the process of official liquidation for our participants, sir? what happens once the IRP fails?
Once the resolution professional fails, the company ought to automatically go into liquidation. The IRP becomes the official liquidator. Now, once the official liquidator is takes charge, so like I said, he would continue, of course, to perform his duties pertaining to instituting or defending claims against the company. He would also collate claims, uh, and the Supreme Court has said he performs a quasi-judicial function. It is not a judicial function which he performs. In one of the judgments, I can just indicate which judgment. So he would collate the claims, and those claims would then, if you have to question those claims, even at that stage, a party has a right to go to the NCLT or the NCLAT, and then he has to take charge of the assets and then distribute the assets uh, uh, for all the claimants as per their priority. So the IBC also provides for a priority of claims, for distribution of assets.
Yes, sir. OL's claims or decisions can also be challenged by the
Yes,
party. Is it so?
before the adjudicating authority and before the appellate authority.
Yes, sir. Directly, can there be any negotiation over the table with the official liquidator before he finally gives the decisions, or it is only after his decision it can be challenged, sir? Whether any kind of alternate dispute resolution mechanism is adopted in these processes?
I would he has to go by whatever the Act provides. So the Act provides that, for example, claims have to be settled in a particular manner. So, say for example, the insolvency resolution process costs are given paramountcy. So therefore, that has to come first. Then workmen's dues and etc. etc. So that procedure has to be followed. Per his wish and desire.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, one more question. How influential can the financial creditors be? Will there have any adverse effect on the IRP's process?
Well, they are in charge of, if the committee of creditors feel that that the insolvency resolution process, a professional is not conforming to his duties, the COC can remove him. In fact, right at the beginning, the COC in his first meeting has to approve the interim resolution professional as the insolvency resolution professional. And like I said, if they are not happy with his work, they can change him at any time of the process, of the procedure. So they are, of course, immensely influential.
Sir, do you think the official these creditors do they have any say once the OL takes over, sir? Do they have any say?
Any say in
the process or in the settlement scheme which he introduces, the one-time settlement offer which the official liquidator gives? Will the creditors, both the FC and OCs, have any say on that?
So once the liquidation procedure starts, like has always been the case, a secured creditor is put at a greater level, to call it, as opposed to an unsecured creditor. And usually you would find financial creditors are secured creditors. It's very rare that a bank would give a loan without taking any security. An operational creditor, on the other hand, may be an unsecured creditor. So to that extent, yes, secured creditors are given a higher weight, or a greater weightage even during the liquidation process.
Yes, sir. One question we have from our participant. It is by Ms. Syed Ahmadi. It is a general question, sir. It also pertains to this topic, but it is after the check bounce. Is there any legal remedy available after the elapse of 3 years for a particular check bounce case?
Unless it's a continuing offense, if I remember correctly. So, for example, if you represent the 3 years, of course not, but a check has a lifetime of, I think, 3 months now or 6 months. So, if within that process, if the check is represented, there is a fresh dishonor. So, you get a fresh cause of action. But could you be a bit more specific about your question?
Yes, sir. Yes, yes. I maybe the participant would be more specific on this question, and maybe they can come back again since we have time. Sir, one more question regarding the OL's performance. The complete power is vested in the hands of OL. How can accountability be established, sir? Other than all the laws which are given through the legislation, is there any transparency or accountability that is being given that has been established by the OL, sir?
What greater accountability can be? Can there be apart from the fact that you can challenge his actions before the NCLT? His orders are subject to judicial review. He's just a quasi-judicial authority.
So that is retrospective, right, sir?
Sorry.
No, that is only after this thing is given by the OL.
After his decision, yes.
Yes. No, is there an interim remedy that is available for the people?
If you think that his decision-making process, there is an inherent flaw in that, you can challenge it at that stage before he makes a decision.
Sir, one question which I have is during the practice, I came to know that during the practice, I have just tried made to understand that the financial creditors have a say in deciding the official the IRP, but the OCs do not have that power.
Yes.
Don't you think there is a this thing in this, sir? Differentiation in this, sir?
So the Supreme Court has now, at least in a couple of cases, upheld the distinction between a financial creditor and an operational creditor. So, like I said, you have to understand. You have to understand the fact that a financial creditor, being usually a bank, is the IBC is not a recovery mode. So let's be very clear about that. It's not a means to recover your money. It is a mean to restructure the company if possible. So is an operational creditor qualified to do that? The Supreme Court has said usually no. It is the banks and financial institutions who have the wherewithal to see restructuring through. An operational creditor, individual, small company, usually interested only in his own money. Correct? So therefore, the Supreme Court has like I said, upheld this distinction between a financial creditor and an operational creditor. Because a financial creditor would usually look at the larger picture as opposed to an operational creditor who is only concerned about his money. So, which is why they've been kept out of certain procedures under the Act.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is only for the due process to follow. Right. Yes, sir. It is for the convenience of the bank and the major financial creditors. It is being entertained. Yes, sir. Sir, with the legal remedy or yes. Sir, the participant has again come back with the same question. Is there any legal remedy or a recourse if my check got bounced a few years ago? What can I do now?
So, as far as the check is concerned, there is broadly nothing, because I would assume that the check, its validity is but you can file a civil suit if you're in the period of limitation, because there'll still be an amount due to you. So there have been many cases in which, on the basis of check, for example, a summary suit has been filed. So if you're within the period of limitation, you can go ahead and file a summary suit. It's still a debt due.
Yes, sir. Sir, slightly deviating from the topic and asking you the recent amendment proposed by the central government for making this check bounce as under section 138 of Negotiable Instrument Act as not a criminal case. What is your take on this, or your views on this? Do you feel it is genuine?
In practice, we have seen that it is only that sometimes it's the sword of a criminal proceeding hanging over your head, which makes you part with your money, easier.
Yes.
So there was some logic there was some reason as to why a check bouncing was made a criminal offense, and I think that by and large that logic still holds good. But of course, what is perhaps required is to tweak the procedure. So we don't want people to be hassled unnecessarily by criminal proceedings. So we make the procedure a bit more simple. We promote, out of court settlements in those cases. So I think to take away the criminal angle totally, my personal opinion is it may be counterproductive, but some tweaking is required in 138 laws. We can't have 138 cases going on for a decade. That beats the entire purpose of a summary procedure.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That was wonderful. Uh, for the audience, I would just like to share with you our special speaker, Mr. Kush, was the counsel who appeared in this recent case of Puri Jagannath Rath Yatra case. And I personally wholeheartedly congratulate you for making this Jagannath Yatra, Puri Jagannath Rath Yatra again, sir. It is only because of your earnest efforts that the Supreme Court has given the verdict. Can you just, for the benefit of our participants, can you just throw some light on the particular case, sir? I know this is still in the appeal stage, but can you just throw some light on this, sir?
So this again was an offshoot of the Corona crisis, because as we all know, the Rath Yatra is a event which is very dear to people from that part of the country, and in fact from all over the country. And so there was a balance to be maintained between public health and the right to practice your religion. So the two things had to be balanced, and initially the Supreme Court was of the view that it is perhaps not possible to hold the Rath Yatra, but when the citizens intervened and when the state government and the central government gave concrete proposals as to how they could manage the Rath Yatra while at the same time safeguarding public health. So then the Supreme Court appreciated the stand and said that the Rath Yatra would go on. The larger question there, of course, is the scope of interference by courts in matters of a religious nature. We've seen the case of Sabrimala, where it almost came down to the orders of the Supreme Court being completely flubbed. So therefore, in such cases, what should be the extent of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction is, of course, a larger question which is to be debated in the Supreme Court.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. On a personal note, this question was asked by Mr. Kamal Palo, who is hailing from Odisha. So he was very happy after knowing that you are the person who have got the permission for the Rath Yatra, sir. And on behalf of my team and on my personal behalf, we thank you for this wonderful contribution to our society, sir. And how much of satisfaction you get when you are taking up these kind of matters vis-a-vis any private matters which you take up, sir?
All matters give you some joy, and especially if you get a good result. But knowing how dear this issue is, so it was especially nice.
Yes, sir. Sir, last question coming up for the day. Can you share your success mantra for our participants, sir? You have practiced and you have cleared your AOR. Now you are exclusive practice in Supreme Court, and you have seen a lot of cases and you have seen ups and downs in your career. Can you share for the benefit of our participants what is your success mantra or the tricks of your trade, sir, in this profession?
Uh, there is no one success mantra, but from what I have seen of the really successful lawyers, uh, when we talk of successful lawyers, we talk of the Mukul Rohtakis of the Supreme Court, the Harish Salves, the Abhishek Manu Singhvis. They all work very hard. So if there is a mantra, that mantra is you have to work hard in this profession. You have to work hard in every profession, but more so in this profession, nothing can give you success as much as hard work can.
Sir, what is the biggest takeaway for you, sir, after coming into this profession?
This profession is unique in the sense, in the practicing in the Supreme Court, the vast variety of matters. No one matter, as every litigation lawyer would tell you, no one matter is ever the same, ever the identical. So we get to work on such a wide variety of matters that it's professionally very fulfilling and very exciting at the same time.
Thank you very much, sir, for this wonderful presentation and taking time for us. Even
My
though
pleasure.
we approached you only a couple of days back, you were ready. You readily accepted our invitation, and you also gave valuable inputs on the particular topic, sir. We are grateful to you. Yeah, and I thank all the participants for participating in this particular webinar. I am sure you might have got some takeaways on in this topic, and we have a lot of exciting other webinars coming up. We have a next webinar on Sunday. It is pertaining to all the things you need to know about MSME by our special speaker, Mr. Tariq Ahmed, practicing in Delhi High Court. Please keep a tab on our Facebook page and also on our YouTube channel to be the first person to receive all the updates about our latest webinars. With this, it is wrap for today's presentation and today's webinar. It is Anand signing off, and I thank on behalf of APLC and on my personal behalf, Anand signing off. Take care. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.